Good afternoon, everyone. This is our first session, our first webinar for the Security and Compliance series for this fiscal year. We're going to talk about protecting your files in Microsoft Teams, and we've got a great cast. We've got Leo and BB who are going to tag team this presentation. We just asked that if you could go on mute during the presentation. You can ask questions through the chat window, or we'll also open it up for verbal questions at the end. With that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Leo.
Thank you, Tony. Hello, everyone. My name is Leo Ramirez, and I work alongside with BB and Tony, and we all work with government customers. And I really enjoy working with government customers and hearing about their challenges because it gives us a chance to help solve these problems. And this is one reason why we're doing things differently in this year's SLG Purview Compliance webinars. Most of these webinars, they're going to be related to scenarios and use cases that government customers have brought to our team. We're also going to be inviting some of our top partners to discuss interesting topics related to Microsoft Purview that government customers should be aware of. Additionally, in some of our future sessions, we're working to have customers as guest speakers so they can answer the #1 question we get asked. What are other customers doing in SLG? But if you're looking to get an introduction to Microsoft Purview solutions, BB is going to drop a link in the chat to our previous webinar series that's been recorded. But let's get started with today's topic, protecting your files in Microsoft Teams. I'm going to get started by presenting a few slides just to set the stage. And then BB, she's going to go deep in a demo. By the way, as Tony mentioned, please feel free to put any questions in the chat. And after the demo, we'll open the mic for questions. Now, as we're talking to customers, protecting data is one of their biggest concerns. And it's because data is everywhere. It's in email. It's in file shares, SharePoint and OneDrive, other third-party cloud repositories. And now the reason we're here today is because it's also in Teams. More and more employees are working from home. And in fact, I'm home right now working. And I bet many of you are as well. So organizations, they have valid concerns for security breaches, especially state and local government agencies. Another topic of much discussion is protecting data so that organizations can meet privacy and compliance regulations. But this is the use case we're here to talk about today. Teams undoubtedly has increased our ability to collaborate. I mean, I'm constantly on Teams. I'm in meetings. I'm looking at files in one of my Teams channels, or I'm chatting with my coworkers. Teams, it's also on my mobile device and even on my personal computer. And I bet the same is for most of you. Now, the use case that is brought to me and BB from customers is, how do we protect our files and Teams depending on who accesses the team, the sensitivity of the data within the team, and if the team is accessed from a managed versus an unmanaged device. Now, this example visualizes the use case. Here are some sensitive files in a team site, and we have different kinds of users accessing this site. Maybe they're employees, contractors, or partners. And maybe we want to allow full access to users if they're on a managed device. But there's scenarios where we want to allow limited access if they're coming in on an unmanaged device. Now, on the other side of that token, if the team site has highly sensitive information, we might want to block access entirely if they're using an unmanaged device. Now, this is a document, and you'll get this link later, that Microsoft published, and it provides some recommendations for how you can configure Teams and their associated SharePoint sites to help protect files, but still balancing security and facilitating collaboration. Now, if we notice here, there's 3 different tiers: the baseline tier, the sensitive tier, and the highly sensitive tier. Now, the recommendations in each of these can be used as a starting point, and then you can adjust as needed to meet your organization's needs. Now, the baseline tier contains public teams or private teams. Now, we all know, or many of us know, that public teams, these are team sites that anyone in the organization can access, whereas private teams can only be accessed by members of the team. Now, in the baseline tier of protection, the recommended configuration is to restrict the sharing of the site and only allow the team site owner to allow access. Additionally, there's not typically sensitive information in a public team site, so allowing full access from an unmanaged device is not a great concern. Again, this is optional. This might be different in your environment. But notice something else: the sensitive and highly sensitive tiers. These are both private sites. But if we drop down, let's notice that we can configure here and set some policies around guest sharing, device access, and even content encryption. So for these types of team sites, the recommendation is to use a sensitivity label. And we're going to go deeper. So this is an example of the baseline tier of protection. Again, with the public team site, it shouldn't contain any sensitive information. So we can simply use a sensitivity label to classify this type of team site. Now, this is optional. And there's also no restrictions based on whether the device is managed or unmanaged. Let's move on to the next tier. Now, this is an example of a sensitive tier of protection. Now, because this site has sensitive information, there are different controls that can be configured. The sensitivity label that's applied here to this team site is limiting access if users come in on an unmanaged device to this team. And you're going to see exactly what this looks like in the demo just shortly. Finally, for the highly sensitive tier of protection, this recommendation is apply a sensitivity label that blocks access if users come in on an unmanaged device. Also has options for limiting access requests. In that setting, the recommendation is to turn that off. Again, you're going to see a lot of this in the demo. Now, to summarize, sensitivity labels, as you guys are probably aware, are mostly associated with being applied to files or emails. But we also have this capability in Purview to apply sensitivity labels to Microsoft Teams sites, SharePoint sites, and Microsoft 365 groups. And just for everyone's awareness, when you apply a sensitivity label to a team, that label also gets applied to its associated SharePoint site, which is the Files tab in the sections of the team. And finally, some of the other settings that can be applied in a sensitivity label, these are the protection settings, again, that can be configured within the label. And you'll be seeing each of these settings within the demo. So how do you get started? These are some of the prereqs, There's only 2 of them. First, you need to enable sensitivity labels for containers. Very simple, easy to do, simple PowerShell command. And second, you need to configure a conditional access policy that restricts access to the labeled team site for unmanaged devices. Finally, for what everybody's been waiting for, we're going to get into the demo. This is what Bibi's going to show. She's going to walk you through how to configure the conditional access policy in Azure. Next, she's going to walk you through the admin side of configuring the sensitivity labeling purview to protect the team site. And finally, she's going to walk you through the end user experience for both limiting access to the team site from an unmanaged device and also blocking access when they're coming in on an unmanaged device. BB's also going to show you a few tips on how you can change the default sharing link using PowerShell. And she's also going to introduce to you a brand new feature for setting a default label on the SharePoint library so that all new documents that are dragged into that library will inherit the default sensitivity label. She's also going to touch on how you can protect chat messages that might have sensitive information. With all this excitement, it's my pleasure to hand it over to BB.
Thank you so much, Leo, for setting the stage. This was very helpful. I'm going to start sharing my screen. I hope all of you are able to see it. So hi, everybody. I am Bhavana Bhatia. I'm a compliance technical specialist at Microsoft. And today I will show you a demo for setting up file sharing security with Teams. So let's first set up the prerequisites. If you want the sensitivity labels to control the access of Teams SharePoint sites from unmanaged devices, then you need to first set up the prerequisites by creating the Azure AD conditional access policy. For this, let's go to Azure portal, and then let's go to the service Azure AD conditional access policy. As you can see, there are no conditional access policies defined yet. So I will be creating one. So let's click on New Policy. I will be applying this policy to all the users. You can scope the policy for specific users if required. I will apply this conditional access policy to Office 365 SharePoint Online. You can also apply the policy to all Office 365 apps from here. Next, let's click on Conditions. Here we can target specific client applications. I'm going to select all the client applications here. So this policy will be applied if someone accesses a SharePoint site or Teams site from an unmanaged device via browser or mobile app or desktop client. Next, let's click on Session. Here I will configure session controls and I will choose Use App Enforced Restrictions. App enforced restrictions are all about ensuring your corporate data doesn't unintentionally end up on devices over which you have no control. Once this is enabled, this feature will prevent your users from downloading, printing, or syncing SharePoint Online data to your unmanaged devices. Unmanaged device could be a device that is not hybrid Azure AD join, or the one that is not Azure AD join, or the one that is not managed via your Intune. You can also block access of SharePoint sites from unmanaged devices. So let's create this conditional access policy. And now it's time to start creating sensitivity labels that will be applied to the teams. Let's go to the Microsoft Purview Compliance Center. I am currently logged in with the Compliance Administrator role, and I will go to the Information Protection link on the left-hand side. You can see all the sensitivity labels that I have created here. Microsoft recommends 3 different tiers of protection for teams to manage information with different sensitivities. The 3 tiers of protection, like Leo mentioned, are baseline protection, sensitive protection, and highly sensitive protection. I will create sensitivity labels for these 3 tiers. This general label here corresponds to the baseline protection. Most of your teams will probably need a baseline protection. The confidential label here corresponds to the sensitive protection tier. And here I'm creating 2 confidential labels for teams. This confidential internal only label can be applied to sensitive teams that are available to people within the organization. The confidential Contoso FTE and partners label can be applied to sensitive teams that are available for full-time employees and for partners. This highly confidential label here corresponds to the highly sensitive protection tier. The highly confidential internal only label can be applied to highly sensitive teams which will be available only for internal users. Now, when you apply these sensitivity labels to teams, the label automatically applies the sensitivity category on the team, and it applies the protection settings to those labeled teams and their underlying SharePoint sites. Now let's start creating the labels. In the interest of time, I will be showing you how to create two sensitivity labels. The first label that I will create is confidential, Contoso FTE and partners, and this will apply the sensitive tier protection. Just for your information, we have a similar sensitivity labeling structure for teams within Microsoft as well. So this example should definitely be helpful. So next, let's click on create a label. Let's give it a name. I'm going to call it Contoso FTE and partners. And then I will provide the description that users will see when they are selecting this label for a team. Let's now define the scope of the label. Labels can be applied to items like files and emails, as well as to entire containers like Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, and SharePoint sites. You can also apply labels to schematized data assets that are beyond Microsoft 365 as well. Now, I want this label to be visible only when users create Teams or SharePoint sites. So I will be only selecting the groups and sites checkbox over here. Click on next. You can define what protection settings should be applied to the teams when this sensitivity label is applied. You can configure the privacy and external user access settings of the labeled teams and sites. And you can also configure external sharing settings of the team sites and configure the access of labeled team sites from unmanaged devices as well. Here I can select the privacy settings to control the level of access for internal and external users. This label applies the sensitive tier of protection to the teams, and as per guidelines, it says teams should be private and only the members of the team should have access to the team. This is why I have selected the private option over here under privacy settings. And under external user access, you can control whether the group owner can add guests to the team or not. Now, since this labeled team or site should be available for full-time employees as well as partners, I will select this checkbox so that owners can add partners outside your organization to this team. When the label is applied, you can control the external sharing settings for the underlying SharePoint site. Since I want to share the content with full-time employees and partners, I will choose content can be shared with to new and existing guests. Next, you can control the access of labeled SharePoint sites from unmanaged devices. And this option uses the Azure AD conditional access prerequisite that we set up earlier. Now, as per the sensitive tier protection guidelines, the labeled site should be allowed with a limited web-only access from unmanaged device. So limiting this access will allow you to your users to remain productive while also addressing the risk of accidental data loss from unmanaged device. And with limited browser-only access, end users will not be able to download, print, or sync files to unmanaged device. So now let's finish creating this label. And then we will publish this label to all the users or certain users within your organization. And then the labels will be visible while creating Teams or SharePoint sites. So we have created the label using UI. However, there are still some more recommendations from this sensitive tier protection for the labeled site. It says site owners and members and people with edit permissions can share files and folders, but only site owners can share the site. We don't want site members to share the entire confidential site outside the organization, right? So to achieve this, you can manually go to the underlying team's SharePoint site and change the settings under site sharing settings. But I don't want to do this manual setting for every sensitive team site in the organization, right? It will take me a lot of time. I want to automate the site sharing settings using sensitivity labels. So using PowerShell, we can specify that when the label is applied, the site sharing setting should be automatically updated. You can use this set label command and you can configure the site sharing settings such that members can only share files and folders and not the entire site. The GUID that is mentioned over here is the GUID of the label confidential Contoso FTN partners that we just created. The sensitive tier of protection for label site also recommends that we set the default sharing link type for the SharePoint site to specific people. By default, the default sharing link provides access to all people within the organization. We don't want to do that for confidential information, right? We want to limit the default sharing link to specific people. Again, to achieve this, you can go manually to the underlying team's SharePoint site through the SharePoint Admin Center. And under the sharing settings, you can change this to specific people here. But I don't want to do this manually for all the sites. So I want to automatically configure this default sharing link type using sensitivity labels. So using this PowerShell here, you can specify that when the label confidential Contoso FTE and partners is applied, set the default sharing link type of that labeled SharePoint site to specific people. All right, so we have configured the confidential Contoso FTE and partner label with all the recommended protection settings. Now it's time to test all that goodness by applying this label to a team. So let's see the end user experience. So this is my end user, Joni Sherman, and she has launched a Teams client. She clicks on Create Team. So let's create Teams from scratch. It now asks her what kind of teams will this be. The sensitivity label dropdown appears here. And under this dropdown, it asks which sensitive tier does she want to select for this team. She can apply the baseline protection using the general label. She can apply sensitive tier protection using one of the two confidential labels here. And she can apply the highly sensitive tier protection using the highly confidential internal only label. Let's say Joni selects the sensitivity label confidential Contoso FTE and partners. Now this label applies sensitive tier of protection on this team. You can see that it has locked the privacy of the team to private. That means only members of the team can access it and people need permissions to join this team. You can see that the public option is disabled. So now let's select that label and create the team. Now Joni can add full-time employees as well as partners to this team. So in this example, you can see Joni has added Johanna, who is a full-time employee, and she has also added another user who is an external user, and he's a partner with that organization. Now, once this label is applied, this sensitivity label is visible under the top right-hand side corner for this team. Let's go to the Files tab. This shows the underlying team's SharePoint site and its contents. You can see that Joni has uploaded two documents here. Let's select the Excel this data to share here and share this document. Notice the default sharing link. By default for SharePoint sites, the default sharing link is set to all people within organization can edit. But since we applied the confidential FTE and partner label on this team site, it has changed the default sharing link to people you specify can edit. So this will ensure that all people within organization do not unnecessarily get access to confidential information. Let's now open the underlying Teams SharePoint site in a browser. So I'm going to click on Open in SharePoint. We had previously configured the site sharing settings of the labeled site using PowerShell. In the SharePoint site, if you go to the Permissions tab, you can see that this labeled site can be shared only by the site owner. The members and people with edit access in this site can only share files and folders, but not the entire site. Now let's consider a scenario where Joni is opening this confidential FT and partner team from an unmanaged device using a browser. She goes to the Files tab in Teams. She will have no ability to download, print, or sync files from this labeled Teams site. Notice that there is no sync option at the top bar of this team. Also, she can't see any download option when she clicks on any of the files. So this way we are minimizing leaks of confidential data on unmanaged devices. Let's open this Excel document here. So this file opened in the browser in Office Online. Notice how the Open in Desktop option on the top is disabled. So here Joni cannot open this file in Excel client and she cannot save this file to the unmanaged device. And it also shows her a message here which says your organization doesn't allow you to download, print, or sync using this device. Let's say Joni copies the URL of the team site and opens it using a browser on an unmanaged device. The SharePoint site also opens in limited web-only access mode. Notice that in SharePoint site, it clearly shows the message, your organization doesn't allow you to download, print, or sync using this device. So that was how we created and tested our first label. Now let's create another sensitivity label called highly confidential internal only. This label corresponds to the highly sensitive teams protection tier. And here we will apply sensitivity labels to the team site and also to the content inside the team site. Also, we will restrict it to internal use only, and we won't be sharing it with partners. So let's go to the information protection portal again inside the Microsoft Purview Compliance Center and click on Create Label. We will give it a name. It's a highly confidential internal only label. And then let's provide the description that users will see when they are selecting this label for a team. Let's now define the scope for the label. I want to apply highly confidential internal only labels to emails and files. And also I want to apply this label to Teams or SharePoint sites. So I will choose both these checkboxes. The protection settings here will apply to labeled files and emails. I can encrypt the content with protection settings when the highly confidential internal only label is applied on it. I can also apply markings like headers and footers to content when the highly confidential internal only label is applied on it. Now, since this sensitivity label should restrict access of content to only people within the organization, I will assign the permissions to only include internal users. Here you can select the content marking settings for files and emails. So example, when this label is applied to a file, it applies a watermark, a header, and a footer that says highly confidential internal only. Here you can define the protection settings for the Teams SharePoint sites. So this sensitivity label applies highly sensitive tier of protection to Teams. And as per the highly sensitive tier protection guidelines, the teams should be private and only members of the team should have access to it. This is why I have selected the private option here under privacy settings. Since this labeled team or site will be available only to people within the organization, I will not select this checkbox that allows group owners to add partners outside your organizations as guests. When the label is applied, you can control the external sharing settings for the underlying SharePoint site. So as per this highly sensitive tier protection guidelines, new and existing guests or only people within organization can have site level guest access for the labeled site. Since this label is used for internal only content, I will select content can be shared with to only people within my organization. Also, access to team site with highly sensitive tier protection should be blocked from unmanaged device. So I'm going to choose this block access and click on next. So now let's save this label, and then we'll have to publish this label to all the users or certain users within the organization so that labels are visible while creating files, emails, Teams, as well as SharePoint sites. So I've created the label using UI. However, there are still some more recommendations from this highly sensitive tier of protection for Teams. It says only site owners can share files and folders on the site, and members should not be able to share the site and content. So I can achieve that through automation. So I'll be using this set label PowerShell command, and I'll specify that when the label highly confidential internal only is applied to a team, the site sharing settings should be updated to members cannot share the site and content. The highly sensitive tier of protection for labeled site also recommends that we set the default sharing link type to people with existing access. So again, we can achieve that using automation and PowerShell. So let's say set label command, and we can set the default sharing link type of the labeled site to people with existing access. Okay, so we have configured our highly confidential internal only label. Now it's time to test it by applying the label to the team. Let's see the end user experience. So this is my end user, Joni Sherman, and she again launches the Teams client, and she clicks on create team. So let's create a Teams from scratch. She can see the sensitivity label drop down here. Under the sensitivity dropdown, it asks what kind of sensitive tier does she want to select, and she can see this highly confidential internal only label that we just now created. So let's assume she selects that label. This label now applies the highly sensitive tier of protection to the team. You can see that this label has locked the privacy of the team to private, and only members of the team can access, and people need permissions to join. The public option is disabled. So she creates this team, and once the label is applied, it will be visible here under the top right-hand side corner of the team. Now Joni wants to add members to this team, and as per the settings in our highly confidential internal only label, only people within the organization will have site level access. So if Joni tries to add an external user to the team, you can see that it says we didn't find any matches. So basically she's not able to add any external user here. But she can add people within her organization to this team. So she has added Johanna, who is a full-time employee. So she is able to add this internal user to the teams. Now, in addition to sensitivity labeling, you can also apply Teams data loss prevention policies in order to prevent sensitive data leaks. So example, if Joni tries to share personally identifiable information or other sensitive information, you can block that Teams conversation from being shared. So here you can see Joni has added some SSN numbers and credit card numbers, and we want to protect this Teams chat itself. So that's why we have implemented a DLP policy behind the scenes, and it has blocked this message. And this pop-up here explains why the Teams message was blocked. So you can also configure the DLP policy in such a way that users can override this message with a proper justification and go ahead and share their chat if required. Okay, so the label has been applied to the Teams and its underlying SharePoint site. But it's very important to note that the content that is uploaded in this Team site will not automatically inherit the labels applied to this team. Example, if I upload documents here inside this highly confidential internal only team site, it does not mean that the documents will automatically inherit that label. But if you want documents inside this library to inherit the label of the team site, you can configure a default label on this library. So for that, let's open this Teams in SharePoint site. We can go to the SharePoint settings and library settings. This is a brand new feature and it lets you add a default sensitivity label to all the documents uploaded in the library. So here you can see the default sensitivity label option, and I'm going to select highly confidential internal only label. I'm going to click on save. And now if Joni uploads files in the Teams channel, those files will automatically be labeled as highly confidential internal only. So now both the Teams site and the content inside the site will have the same labels. And also the labels on these files will ensure that the files are encrypted and protected with access only for internal users. Even if someone accidentally downloads this document and shares it outside the organization, the label and protection will travel with the content, and people outside the organization will not be able to access this content. When Joni shares a document from this team site, notice that it has set the default sharing link to people with existing access can use this link. So this again ensures that all people within organization do not unnecessarily get access to any highly confidential content. The highly sensitive protection tier says that you can only share content with people inside the organization. So if Joni tries sharing this file with an external user, she gets a message that says, your organization doesn't allow sharing with these people. Now let's consider a scenario where Joni is accessing this team from an unmanaged device using a browser. When she goes to the Files tab in Teams, it doesn't let her access it from her unmanaged device. It gives access denied error, and it also says due to organizational policies, you can't access this resource from this untrusted device. Even if she opens the SharePoint site from unmanaged device using its URL, she will be blocked from accessing the highly confidential site from the unmanaged device. And when access is blocked, users will see the same access denied error message. So this brings us to the end of the demo. We saw how to create two different sensitivity labels to protect content in Teams. And we also saw how the end user experience looks like. I really hope this demonstration will help you start protecting your files in Teams. I will now hand over this session to Tony, who will give us some more information. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Bibi. A great presentation, great demo. So now that you've seen this in action, Purview in action, you're probably wondering how to get started with Microsoft Purview, and we have a number of resources available for our customers. So so we have we rely on partners heavily these days. So we can bring in a partner to work with you. There's plenty of Microsoft funding for those of you that have gone through the exercise in the past. It's fairly straightforward. You just have to work with your account team to put together a statement of work and select a partner, and then we can bring a partner on site to help you or remotely to help you enable some of these services. For those of you that have Premier support or unified support, there's a bunch of workshops and a compliance assessment available to you. We also have fast track assistance. So if you already own these tools today, fast track is a free is a resource that's available to you at no additional cost. You can work with your modern work architect to do a pilot and configure and enable these services. Then lastly, BB and Leo are available to, and Steve are available to go deeper if you have any additional questions. So you can schedule a meeting through our shared mailbox, msslgcompliance@microsoft.com, and we can work with you to set that up. Additionally, you can work directly with with your security and compliance solution specialist or your account team if you know who they are, and they will gladly set you up with some assistance. Next slide, please. So some resources for all of you. As I mentioned, we've got our MSSLG compliance alias. You can always reach out to us on that. We've got some great documentation up on our Microsoft website, and then all these webinars are recorded and posted to our to our YouTube channel. Right there, Microsoft SLG Modern Work. And we did paste the link in the chat window. So for those of you that are following along in the chat, you can access it there as well. And next slide, please. And this is the next few sessions that we have planned. So as you see, we went through Microsoft Purview Information Protection today. In 2 weeks, we'll go through e-discovery standard and premium. Then we'll dive into Purview audit premium capabilities, and then we'll go into Microsoft Purview data connectors, and then Microsoft Entra permissions management. So we're planning to run these throughout the year until June of 2023 at a minimum. So we'll as we come up with additional topics, we'll post them here, and we'd like to hear from you. So if you have an idea of a topic that you'd like to learn more about, feel free to to send us an email, and we'll happily consider it and possibly add it to the agenda. Is there one more slide? Nope, that's it for slides. So we'll open it up for questions. So you can either come off mute and ask your questions verbally, or you can use the chat window to ask questions.
I'm going to go ahead and answer Colleen's question that she put in the chat. I stopped the recording though.